There is a photograph tucked inside the front cover of a ledger kept at the County Agricultural Extension Office in a small River Valley town, and it shows a woman standing beside a wooden sledge piled so high with wet, dark grain that the runners have sunk 3 inches into the frozen mud of the road. She is wearing a canvas coat 2 sizes large for her, and her boots are wrapped in burlap at the ankles. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking back down the road she has already traveled, as though calculating whether the sledge will make it one more trip before the runners split. The steers in the background are blurred, moving toward a trough you cannot see. The photograph carries no caption, but someone has written in pencil on the back, in a hand that slants hard to the right, the words, "What the others threw away kept what mattered alive." That sentence is the whole story. Everything that follows is just the proof of it. The winter the photograph was taken had announced itself early, the way hard winters do, not with drama, but with a kind of quiet insistence. The first cold came in the second week of October, 2 full weeks before it was supposed to. And when it came, it did not leave again to let the warmth return the way people expected. The creeks dropped fast. The pasture grasses went gray and flat. A man who had farmed the next hollow over for 30 years said he had not seen the cattails along the lower marsh turn that particular shade of amber before Christmas. He said it the way men say such things, casually, at the feed store, to no one in particular. And then he bought his usual order and went home. Clara Voss, who was standing 3 feet behind him, buying a single box of salt blocks, heard every word. She was 41 years old that October, and she had been running the 80-acre home place alone for 4 years, since her husband Everett died of a summer fever in the July of the year she turned 37. There were 42 steers on the place, all of them Herefords of moderate frame, the kind of cattle that could put on condition in good grass, but could also drop weight frightening fast when feed ran short. She had a hay supply she had cut herself through August, 160 bales, which she had calculated would carry the herd through a normal winter with a narrow margin. She had always run her numbers in a soft-covered notebook, the same brand and color from one year to the next, bought in lots of 4 at the general merchandise in town. She knew precisely what 160 bales meant, and she knew what a 2-week early freeze meant, and she stood in the feed store holding her salt blocks and did the arithmetic that everyone else in that valley had not yet thought to do. The answer was not good. She paid for her salt blocks and drove home. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford, and besides, she had a habit her mother had taught her, which was that before you despair, you must first inventory, and before you inventory, you must first ask. The asking was the part people skipped. They skipped it because it required admitting you needed something, and admitting need made people feel that the ground had gone soft under them. Clara Voss did not feel that way. She felt that the ground was always soft somewhere, and that you moved across it carefully, or you did not move at all. She had passed the Hartman Brothers malting operation 100 times on the road into town. A low gray building set back from the highway with a gravel lot and a loading dock and 3 silver silos that caught the afternoon light. She had never gone inside. She drove past it the morning after her arithmetic at the feed store, and she turned around in the lot of the Lutheran church and drove back. And she pulled up to the loading dock and went in through the side door and asked for whoever was in charge of the spent mash. The man she found was not the foreman. He was a young man in rubber waders with a clipboard, and he told her that the spent mash came out of the mash tuns every 3 days in quantities that the operation paid to have hauled to a rendering facility south of the county. He said this the way he said everything, which was with the confidence of a person who has just learned a fact and not yet had cause to doubt it. Clara asked him how much it cost them to haul. He named a figure. She asked whether they would prefer to pay that figure or to have her haul the material herself and eliminate the cost entirely. He looked at her for a moment, then he said he would have to ask the foreman. She said she would wait. The foreman was a large, careful man named Detlef Hartmann, the younger of the two brothers whose name was on the building, and he listened to what Clara proposed with his arms folded and his head tilted slightly to one side, the way a person listens when they have already decided they are hearing something unusual and have not yet decided whether unusual means good or bad. She would haul the spent mash herself, she said, every 3 days or close to it, in her wagon or her sledge, depending on the ground. She would take all of it, every load, and she would do it without charge to them. And in return, they would hold it for her at the dock rather than letting it go to the renderer. He asked her what she intended to do with it. She said she intended to feed it to cattle. He looked at her boots. He looked at her truck. He said he would give her a month's trial. She shook his hand and drove home and began. The first load she hauled that same afternoon, a full wagon bed of wet spent mash, dark as loam, smelling of warm grain and yeast, steaming faintly in the October cold. Her border collie, a dog named Mule, for reasons that had made sense to Everett, ran alongside the wagon and kept looking up at her with the expression dogs wear when they know something unusual is happening, but have decided their job is to supervise rather than object. Clara backed the wagon up to the trough she had already prepared, a long wooden feed bunk built against the south wall of the main barn where the windbreak was best, and she shoveled out the load by hand, working steadily, the steam rising off the mash and curling around her wrists. The steers came in carefully at first, the way cattle approach the unknown, with their necks low and their nostrils working. Then the big red roan, who had always gone first at anything new, put his head down and ate, and the others followed. She watched them eat. Mule sat beside her. She pulled the soft-covered notebook from her coat pocket and wrote the date and the load number and the weight she estimated, and the time the steers took to finish the trough. And then she wrote, in small letters at the bottom of the page, the thing she was trying to prove, which was this: moisture is energy too, if you understand what carries it. That was the principle. She had read it in the agricultural bulletins her mother had saved from 20 years prior. Bulletins printed on newsprint and stored in a cardboard box in the root cellar, written by a county extension agent whose name no one in the valley seemed to remember anymore. The bulletins described a practice common in the river valleys of the prior century, when distilleries and malting operations had been closer to farms than they were now, and when farmers with no money for grain had learned to supplement winter feed with the wet byproduct of fermentation, which carried residual proteins and fermentable sugars, and a caloric density that the old bulletins measured in units no longer commonly used. She had converted the units by hand. The numbers held. No one had told her to look in the root cellar. No one had mentioned the bulletins. She had found them herself on the day she cleaned out the cellar after her mother died, 3 winters before Everett's fever, and she had read them in the way she read everything, which was slowly and twice, and with a pencil for the numbers she wanted to keep. She had not planned to use them then. She had simply filed them in the notebook, in the back pages she kept for reference, and she had continued on. The ground is always soft somewhere. You prepare your footing before you need it. By the 3rd week of October, she had hauled 5 loads. By the 1st week of November, she had hauled 11. Each trip was 12 miles round, the road worsening as the frost deepened and the gravel shoulders turned to ruts. She made the trips before dawn when she could, or in the late afternoon after the other chores, and she was always back before full dark because the road had a long curve near the creek crossing, where the ice came first, and you had to know it was there. She knew it was there. She drove accordingly. Mule rode in the truck cab on the cold mornings, pressed against her right leg, watching the road with the same serious attention he gave to anything that moved. The neighbors noticed the trips. Neighbors always notice. The first one to say something was Howard Dressler, who ran the corn operation to the east, and who had a way of delivering unwelcome observations with a voice of pure, warm sympathy, so that you could not be certain whether you were being pitied or mocked, and therefore could not know which kind of answer to give. He stopped her in the road one morning in the second week of November, his truck across from hers, windows down in the cold, and he said he had heard she was hauling wet mash from the malting plant. She said she was. He said, with the full warmth of a man delivering a hard truth to a woman he respected, that spent mash without a proper dry supplement was unpredictable in cold weather, and that there were some who had tried it and found the cattle lost condition rather than gained it. She looked at him. She said the cattle were gaining. He nodded slowly, as a person nods when they have decided to let time prove them right, and he drove on. 2 weeks after that, it was Lorene Stutzman, who was not unkind, but who had a habit of expressing concern in the form of gifts, and who arrived at Clara's gate with half a side of cured pork wrapped in brown paper, and a look of such tender worry on her face that Clara almost felt guilty for being all right. Lorene said she had been thinking about Clara all alone out here, with the cold coming, and those cattle, and all those miles she was driving every few days, and she pressed the pork into Clara's hands and said that if she ever needed anything, or if the steers were not doing well, she should not hesitate. Clara thanked her for the pork, which was genuine, and said the steers were doing well, which was also genuine. And Lorene drove away looking not entirely reassured, which Clara understood was simply Lorene's nature and could not be helped. In the third week of November, the county agricultural agent came, a man named Rudolph Sauer, who wore a wool suit coat even on farm visits, and who carried a leather case of pamphlets that he distributed as though they were a form of medicine. He had heard about the mash feeding, he said, and he wanted to make sure Clara was aware of the nutritional parameters involved and the risks of an unbalanced winter ration. He was not unkind. He was, in fact, very kind. He opened his leather case and produced a pamphlet and set it on her kitchen table and talked for several minutes about protein ratios and dry matter requirements and the published recommendations of the State Livestock Board. Clara poured him coffee and let him talk. When he was finished, she opened her own notebook to the page where she had been tracking the steers' body condition scores, which she had been recording twice a week since the first load of mash arrived, and she turned the notebook around and slid it across the table to him. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them again. He said carefully that the trend was encouraging, but that it was still early. She said yes. He drank his coffee and took his pamphlet and left, and she watched his car go down the lane, and she wrote the date in the notebook and went back to work. The one person who did not say the wrong thing was a woman named Inez Brower, who had come into the valley 4 years prior from somewhere east to work the small orchard and market garden she had leased on the old Pfeiffer place. She was younger than Clara by about a decade, and she had the kind of quietness that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having decided very early that most occasions do not require it. She came by one afternoon in early December with a jar of apple preserves, which she set on the porch railing without ceremony. And then she looked at the feed bunk along the south wall and at the steers working the mash trough. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "How much are you figuring they are gaining on this?" Clara said she had them up close to 2 pounds a day on average, with the hay supplement combined. Inez looked at the steers again. She said, "What does the mash cost you per load?" Clara said it cost her nothing but the hauling. Inez looked at her then, directly, the way a person looks when they have understood something that took longer than expected to grasp. She said, "Do you want help with the hauling?" Clara said she would not say no to that. After that, Inez came on Tuesday and Friday mornings. She drove a heavier truck than Clara's and could take a larger load in a single trip, and she did not talk unnecessarily on the road or afterward. And when there was something to observe, she said it plainly and waited for a plain answer. They built a second feed bunk together in the first week of December, the posts sunk by hand into frozen ground that fought the bar with every stroke, working in the early dark with lanterns, Mule circling the project with intense administrative concern. When it was done, Inez looked at it and said, "That'll hold." Clara wrote the date and dimensions in the notebook. They split the cost of the lumber without being asked to, and neither of them kept track of who had paid more. December deepened. The cold settled in not as a force, but as a permanent condition, as though the warmth had simply retired and left the cold in its place as the new management. The road to the malting plant became a test of patience and of differential, two qualities Clara had in equal supply. By mid-December, she had completed 18 loads. By Christmas, she had completed 22. The mash was coming out of the tons more frequently now because the plant had increased production for the winter demand. And Detlef Hartmann had taken to leaving a signed gate card at the dock so that Clara or Inez could load any morning without waiting for a supervisor, a courtesy that he extended without remark and that Clara received the same way. She was watching things no one else was watching. She was watching the steers' coats, which were thickening and lying flat in the way that well-conditioned cattle carry winter. She was watching the fat cover over their ribs, running her hands along their sides twice a week in the cold dark of the barn, writing the scores in the notebook. She was watching the hay bales, counting them with the same scrupulous attention she gave to every resource she had. And she was watching the slow, steady arithmetic by which the mash loads were extending those bales further into the winter than they could possibly have reached alone. Every load of mash displaced approximately 1.5 bales of hay in the daily ration. 25 loads meant the equivalent of 37 bales saved. 37 bales meant 3 weeks of additional margin in a winter that was not going to behave. Across the road, Howard Dressler had purchased supplemental ground corn in October against the long winter. A good decision, but an expensive one. And he had not purchased enough because in October, the winter had looked like a normal winter to everyone but the cattails in the lower marsh. He had purchased more in November at a price considerably higher than October's price. He had purchased a final emergency supply in the third week of December at a price that made the November price look modest. He was not ruined by this, but he was not comfortable, and his cattle, which were heavier-framed animals requiring more fuel, were on a rationed program that was leaving them lower in condition than he wanted them. He did not mention this to Clara. He mentioned it once, in passing, at the co-op, to the man behind the counter, in the way that farmers mention things they would prefer not to have become general knowledge, and which therefore become general knowledge within 48 hours. Clara heard about it through Inez, who heard about it through the orchard supply man who had been at the co-op the same morning. Clara listened and said nothing and continued her preparations. the last days of December brought a thaw that lasted 4 days and raised everyone's spirits in proportion to how desperately they needed raising. People in the valley began to talk about the weather breaking, about the worst being over, about January often being milder than December, which is the kind of optimism that the land occasionally punishes and occasionally rewards, and that it is almost impossible to distinguish from wisdom while you are inside it. Clara did not talk about the weather breaking. She used the 4 days of thaw to complete her 25th haul, the largest single load she had managed, the sledge runners gliding easily over the softened ground, and to build a third covered bay in the feed bunk system to keep the mash from freezing in place before the steers could work through it. She was reading signs the thaw could not conceal. The creek gauge she checked every morning had risen fast during the thaw and was now dropping fast again, faster than the temperature alone could account for, which meant the subsoil freeze was deeper than the surface suggested. The starlings had shifted their roost from the east woodlot to the west woodlot, which put the wind at their backs in a direction she knew. Mule had been sleeping closer to the stove than usual for 10 days running, and he was a dog who managed his own temperature with uncanny precision. She wrote all of this in the notebook. She wrote under it, in the same small letters she had used in October. What the others threw away kept what mattered alive. She read it back. She closed the notebook. On the 3rd of January, the temperature dropped 22 degrees in 6 hours. She was awake before it arrived. She had set 2 additional lanterns in the barn the night before, not for light, but for the small animal warmth they gave off, a trick from the old bulletins that the extension agent would not have found in any of his pamphlets. She had filled the mash bunks to capacity. She had broken and rebanked the wind barriers along the north side of the lot, using baled straw she had been keeping precisely for this. When the cold came, she was already in the barn, moving among the steers, counting. Mule was at the barn door. The cold came through the boards in a way that was different from ordinary cold. Not a draft, but a presence, the way serious things arrive, without announcement, having already decided. For 4 days, the temperature did not rise above 0 in the valley. On the 5th day, it dropped further. The roads became impassable in several places, not because of snow, though there was some, but because the cold itself had seized the ruts and ridges of the gravel into a fixed surface that was navigable only by those who knew exactly where the road was beneath the ice, and exactly how their vehicle would respond to it. Clara did not drive to the malting plant during those 4 days. She did not need to. She had 25 loads already in the bunks, already in the steers, already metabolized into the fat cover her hands had been measuring twice a week for months. What she had banked was not hay and not mash, but time. And time was the one thing the cold could not take away from her because she had spent it before the cold arrived. Howard Dressler ran out of supplemental corn on the 8th day. He called the supply operation south of town and was told the roads were closed. He called the co-op and was told the co-op was working through its emergency allocation by seniority of account, and he should expect delivery in 4 to 6 days. His cattle were big-framed and demanding, and they had gone into the hard cold at a condition score lower than he wanted, and now they were burning reserves they did not have against a cold that showed no sign of relenting. He walked his lots twice a day and did what he could with what he had, which was very good hay and stubborn hope, and the accumulated practical knowledge of 30 years, none of which was equal to the arithmetic of the situation. On the 9th day, he walked across the road. Clara heard the boots on the porch boards before he knocked. She opened the door. He was a big man, and the cold had taken some of the size out of him, the way cold does when you are carrying worry on top of it. His face was composed in the particular way of a person who has rehearsed what they are going to say and is not entirely certain it will come out right. He said he was in a tight spot with his feed supply, and he wondered whether she might know of anything available in the county. She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Come in." He came in. She put coffee on and sat down at the table with her notebook, and she did not say anything about the thing he had said to her in the road in November, or about the pamphlet, or about the condition scores. None of that mattered now. What mattered was the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was that she had 42 steers in good condition, 3 weeks of combined mash and hay supply remaining, and one neighbor whose animals were in trouble. She opened the notebook to the last pages where she had written the converted numbers from the old bulletins, and she turned it around and slid it across the table, the same way she had slid it to the extension agent. Except this time she kept her finger on the relevant line and said, "The rendering plant will still take the mash even in weather like this. They have a heated loading dock. If you call Detlef Hartmann and give him my name, he will set you up to haul. It will not solve everything, but it will buy your animals time." He looked at the numbers. He was quiet for a long time in the way that men are quiet when they are working against their own resistance. He said, "I told you in November the mash was unreliable." She said yes. He said, "The cattle are gaining on it." She said hers were. He said, "I was wrong." She said she appreciated that. She pushed the coffee toward him, and he drank it, and they talked for another 20 minutes about the mechanics of the thing, the ratio, the supplement, the bunk management in severe cold, and she answered every question he had because the questions were genuine, and the animals in his lot had not chosen their owner's certainty and did not deserve to pay for it. He hauled his first mash load 2 days later, once the road to the malting plant was passable again. It was not enough, arriving as it did late and short, but it was something, and something is always better than the alternatives, which are nothing and too late. Lorene Stutzman's son had cattle of his own on a rented place 6 miles further up the valley, and he came through the cold in worse condition than Howard Dressler, because he was younger and had less hay reserve, and had spent the good weather months improving his equipment rather than his feed supply, which is an error that equipment cannot repair. He came to Clara not through pride stripped away by cold, but through his mother, who called Clara on the 12th day of the hard freeze and asked in the voice of a woman asking for something she finds very difficult to ask for, whether Clara knew anything that might help. Clara said she would drive up that afternoon if the road would take it. The road took it. She spent 2 hours at the young man's operation, walking the lots, looking at the cattle, doing the arithmetic on what he had remaining and what he needed, and what could be managed without a truck she didn't have. She called Detlef Hartmann from the young man's kitchen and arranged an immediate allocation of mash, held at the dock under his name, at no charge, to be hauled against the spring and settled in labor helping the Hartmann operation with its own lot maintenance. She did this without being asked whether she had the authority to arrange it. She had spoken with Hartmann 6 times in 3 months, and she knew what he would and would not accept. And this was something he would accept. He confirmed it that evening when she drove past the plant on the way home and stopped in. He said he was sorry the cold had caught people short. She said she was sorry, too. Rudolph Sauer, the extension agent, came back to her kitchen in the 3rd week of January, after the worst of the cold had broken to something merely severe rather than extraordinary. He came without his leather case and without his pamphlets. He came with a legal pad on which he had written a series of questions, which he asked carefully and in order, and she answered each one from the notebook, which she laid open on the table and did not close. The questions were about the ratios and the timing and the bunk management and the condition scores and what units the old bulletins had used and how she had converted them. She answered all of it. At the end, he said, "The bulletin authors had the right principle, but nobody in the current literature picks it up." She said, "No, they don't." He asked if he could borrow the relevant pages of the old bulletins to copy. She said she would do better than that, and she went to the back pages of the notebook and tore them out carefully along the binding and gave them to him, because they had been transcribed twice already, and she could write them again. He looked at the torn pages in his hand. He said he wanted to make sure the county had this available. She said that was why she was giving it to him. The hard cold finally broke in the first week of February. When it broke thoroughly, the way this valley's winters sometimes do, as though the cold had spent everything it had in those January weeks and had nothing remaining. The temperature came up 15 degrees in 2 days, and the roads opened, and the sky went from white to a thin, clear blue, and the cattle in the valley's lots began to walk differently, the way cattle walk when the pressure of cold has been lifted, and they can feel the ground again without guarding against it. Clara walked her lots on the morning the weather broke. She walked them with her notebook in her hand, and Mule at her heels. The steers were carrying condition that was, to her practiced hand and eye, better than they had been at the start of winter, which was a thing that almost never happened in a hard winter, and which was the direct result of 12 weeks of preparation and 25 loads of what a rendering operation had been paying to have hauled away. She wrote the final condition scores in the notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote the total loads hauled, which was 25, and the estimated hay equivalent saved, which was 37 bales, and the days of margin that had represented in the hardest stretch, which was 23 days. Then she wrote one more line in the same small letters she had used twice before, and then she closed the notebook. Inez Brower came that afternoon with a jar of winter apple cider and sat on the porch in the thin February sun and watched the steers move across the lot in the new warmth. She said, "They look good." Clara said they were good. Inez said, "What will you do in the spring?" Clara thought for a moment and said she would plant the south field that had been in sod for 3 years because the mash-fed steers would have given her enough to work with. Inez said she might want to expand the orchard and could use a steady source of organic matter for the new trees. Clara looked at her. She said, "I imagine Hartman will keep needing someone to haul." Inez said, "I imagine he will." They sat in the sun and drank the cider and did not say anything else for a while, which was the kind of conversation that does not require words to be complete. The county extension office eventually published a 2-page technical note, authored jointly by Rudolph Sauer and the state beef specialist, on the supplemental use of spent brewing and malting byproducts in winter cattle finishing rations, with particular reference to cold weather management of mash moisture content and bunk protection. The technical note cited no specific farm operation and no specific individual. It cited instead the agricultural bulletins from the prior century, recovered from a private collection in the valley, author unknown. Clara read the technical note when Sauer mailed her a copy. She read it twice, with a pencil for the numbers she wanted to check. The numbers agreed with hers. She filed the note in the back of the next notebook, behind the page where she had already written out the bulletin numbers again from memory, and she began the new season's records on the first page. The steers she had carried through that winter sold in the late spring at weights that surprised the buyer. A man from the sale barn in the next county, who had handled cattle for 20 years, and who said, looking at the lot before he made his offer, that he had not seen animals come out of a hard winter in this kind of shape, and asked what she had fed them. She told him. He looked at her for a moment, and then he wrote the number in his book and offered a price that was fair by any measure, and better than she had projected, and she accepted it. And she drove home and wrote the number in the notebook, and underneath it, she wrote what she had written twice before and would write again at the end of every season for as long as she kept records. The photograph in the extension office has been there for 31 years. New agents come and go, and none of them are entirely sure who put it there. The penciled inscription on the back is in a hand no one currently on staff recognizes. The woman in the photograph is still looking down the road she came from. Mule is just visible at the edge of the frame, sitting very straight, watching her. The sledge runners are deep in the mud. The load is enormous and wet and steaming slightly in the cold. What the others threw away kept what mattered alive.